Last I left off with Far Gone Frontier, I was in this huge refactor. I remade almost everything from the main character to the environment. For better or worse, huge portions of the game are getting totally rewritten. Well, the refactoring actually didn't end there. In fact, that was kind of the beginning of it. Immediately after that video, I jumped into the enemies, rewriting the entire enemy class, which of course means every single enemy has to get rewritten too, so I kind of threw away every enemy in the whole game. No, it's great. I'm not upset about that or anything. No, surprisingly enough, it's not all downside. Beyond the fact that the code is way more readable and I know exactly what's going on, because I have more clarity on what I need enemies to do, I'm doing so many things differently. One small thing that matters a lot was dedicating time to spawning the enemy. One of the worst feelings playing my game before is that enemies could sometimes just spawn on top of you. I did have a small animation that played that prevented you from taking damage, but it wasn't nearly enough. So I quickly animated this. We'll see if it's permanent, but it's a small, really nice addition. A bigger change that I did going forward was implement really modular status effects. Because before, when I was doing any status effect, it was really random. I'd have the bright idea to add, let's say, poison to a gun. In the past, I would open up the old enemy class and maybe add poison as a stat it could have, and then retroactively go through every enemy I've ever made and make it so it's not going to be broken. No, yeah, it was usually always broken. Just think of the worst way you could implement anything, and then that's what I was doing. But now it's nice to finally do things the right way. And like I said, it's modular. Or at least, I think it is, if I'm using the word correctly. Previously, I had the glue gun, which slowed enemies, and then I had some ice mod somewhere that froze them. So I want to start off by bringing these two statuses back. They kind of do the same thing. Essentially, they're just changing the enemy's movement. So I mean, if everything is consistent in enemies, it really shouldn't be that hard, hypothetically. One thing I lucked into then, which I still use now, is that I tie everything to the animation of the sprite. Whenever an enemy attacks, it's always waiting for the sprite to finish, and the same thing is true whenever it moves or it does anything really. So previously, when I had the slow effect, all I did was change the speed scale of the sprite. If I assume it normally plays at 1, whatever that means, if I change that to 0.5, then all of a sudden he has a slow motion effect. Albeit a very framey one, but I think it works. You know, they call me the cut corner kid, so that's one status down. For freeze, I kind of want to do the same thing, but make it more visually interesting. Previously, I drawn these two different ice cubes, one for small enemies and one for medium ones, and the plan here is just to put this over the enemy and make their speed scale 0. Now, this actually adds a little bit of upkeep to creating new enemies. I basically just have to make sure the position of this ice cube makes sense, and the enemy has a size class, so we match that up with the size of the ice cube, which for now is just 2, small and medium, but I imagine if we have a boss, we're going to need a much bigger ice cube. Now, after this, I felt a little stumped, because it turns out status effects sort of overlap in what they do. When I was thinking of status effects for different games, I kept coming back to things that affect movement or things that inflict damage. And since I currently don't have any damage ones, my first go-to was poison. Something I haven't covered yet is that before when I was doing statuses, it just sort of blanket gave it to the enemy. The enemy isn't slowed, you hit them with something, and now they're slow. But the way I envision poison in almost all status effects is that they have some kind of resistance. So now that's locked into the enemy class. They basically have a maximum you have to hit for the status to go into effect, but it gives me the best of both worlds. If I want to slowly give status on enemies, I can do that, or I just want to say if you get a million freeze, the enemy just gets frozen. Alright, so back to poison, the really boring one. It slowly builds up, and then once it triggers, it just does damage. I did make it so that the poison lasts forever, which kind of gives it this battle of attrition vibe. I might change that down the line, but for now, that's kind of fun. And for the last status, I wanted to do something with damage, but I was stuck between flame or bleed. Ultimately, I settled on flame. I thought I could do something more interesting. Bleed just felt like a different version of poison. I made it so that when flame triggers, this pillar flame spawns on the enemy, and it does double the damage that poison does, but it doesn't last super long before it fades away. I played with the idea of having the fire spread to other enemies, and I actually kind of like that a lot. It kind of gives this Forest Fire-esque gameplay loop. I don't know how impactful it'll be in game, but it felt fun to implement. And that's where I kind of left off for statuses. I posted about it, asking if there were any that I left out, and everyone said that I should do one where enemies turn friendly. And that was a horrible idea. I totally fell down that rabbit hole for like 3 days. Halfway through recreating the enemy class for like the 3rd time, I had the realization that this is probably not what my game's about. Which is to say, I am open to adding more statuses in the future, and I even wrote down documentation on how to add them, but they'd have to be something pretty simple. Definitely let me know though, because I'm always open for more suggestions. Aside from working on those statuses, I've been actively taking time to reflect on the skills it takes to be a game developer. For some reason, game development just touches on so many different aspects to make one project. There's always so much to learn, but luckily there's help out there, like the sponsor of today's video, Skillshare. Skillshare is the largest online learning community for creatives, and they really have everything on here that encompasses game dev. It's kind of insane. From art and animation, in-depth classes on Unreal, Unity, Godot, even classes on audio engineer or music or recording. You know, I wish I had this growing up, because it felt like the Wild West trying to learn anything online back in the day. But now, anything I can think of, there's a class for. A class that immediately stuck out to me, to the shock of no one, was this class called Pixel Art Coloring. As much as I'm more comfortable doing the art side of game dev, I don't know everything, and it's so nice to get a refresher, especially on color theory. He had this really interesting take where he'd have this drawing of a coin, and he would redo the color palette for the coin based on literally any image. It was actually kind of fascinating how well it worked, and now I'm thinking to myself, I really want to try that. But if having some structure is more your thing, Skillshare also has learning paths, a collection of curated sequential classes focusing on mastering a specific skill. It's a really cool concept, and the first 500 people to join using my link get 1 month free. That way you can try it out without any worry while still supporting the channel. I want to thank Skillshare so much for sponsoring the video. All right, let's get back into it. Now, in the middle of all this refactoring, I will say I am playtesting way more than ever before. Although, weirdly enough, there's less to playtest now than ever. The game is totally taken apart. And one thing that never quite felt right, especially since I integrated controller support, was the TNT. And to be frank, it always just felt too strong. strong, especially when it was on keyboard and mouse. You would just right click and the TNT would basically go exactly where you clicked. It's an AoE that's doing massive damage. It constantly felt like the best way to play the game is just stack enemies and throw TNT. And I hated it. It always felt like I was incentivizing the player to play the worst way. So I took it upon myself to rework the TNT from the ground up. Initially, I started off with the idea of just placing the TNT and walking away, which was okay. It's kind of boring, to be honest. In order to spice it up and make it my own, I started playing around with the idea that you could hold the TNT sort of like cooking a grenade. And so far, this feels like a good compromise. You can kind of run into enemies holding the TNT, then drop it right in the middle of them while you dodge away. I thought, all right, that's an okay start, but is there anything else I can do here to make my game more unique? And then it sort of dawned on me. I have all these status effects that I'm putting on enemies. Why can't we give this to the TNT? Sure, obviously we can put flame on the TNT, so when it explodes, it inflicts some level of fire. But since we're not throwing this TNT anymore, how are we getting it from the player to the enemy besides just kamikazing it? And the answer is, of course, you shoot it. Since the bullets contain these status effects that normally affect enemies, we can now put it on the TNT, and then when the TNT explodes, it puts all those status effects on the enemy. So if you have a gun that has a really powerful status effect like freeze, with some carefully placed bombs and bullets, you can kind of form your own powerful AoEs. So I sort of jerry-rigged this all together just so I can see if this feels cool. And sure enough, the first time the TNT hits and functions like a massive freeze bomb that stops every enemy, I think I have something kind of interesting, or at least I hope so. And that kind of brings me to the current state of Far Gone Frontier. In some ways, the game has never been in a worse or better state, both simultaneously. I keep taking steps back on what I really think the game is and what the game should be. But I think that's good. For so long, it felt like my game dev journey is just, can I do this? Rather than what's actually good for the game and what would be most fun. I've taken so much time to reflect on that, mixed with watching tons of game dev YouTubers. I mean, if you've done a devlog in the past year, chances are I've probably actually seen it. I'm trying to get into the right mindset to not only make this game come together, but to make it something my own. It's funny, I feel kind of dumb not doing all this a lot earlier, especially when it comes to playtesting, but even though I'm late, it's much better than never. And I'm hoping I can really implement some good practices here to actually make a game and get it on Steam. Thank you guys so much for watching. Thanks again to Skillshare for sponsoring this video. And until next time, I'll see you guys later.